Good evening. I'd like to give a warm welcome to our community guests on behalf of Chancellor Wartell. And I want to thank our campus family for your faithful support of the Omnibus Lecture Series all these years. My name is Irene Walters, and I'm Executive Director of University Relations and Communications. On behalf of the Omnibus Steering Committee, we invite you to submit names of nationally recognized speakers whom you'd like to hear speak. Since 1995, the Omnibus Lecture Series has been sponsored by English Bonner Mitchell Foundation, whose support has allowed IPFW to host, as of tonight, 99 outstanding and informative programs. We are so deeply grateful for that support. Similarly, I want to thank our media sponsors, Wayne TV and NIPR, who have also been along for the ride and the promotion, all 99 lectures. Now, our 100th program, which I know you are all dying to know what it is, but I can't tell you, until March 27th. Tickets will be available that day at the Larson office, which is in the Gates Center. So, mark your calendar for April 12th. I promise you, you are not going to want to miss that. And you can get the tickets on March 27th, and then you'll know why. Now, whether or not you are an educator, we are all interested and concerned about the state of education in America. During the day today, our students and faculty had the opportunity to interact with our speaker, education historian and author Diane Ravitch. Tonight, we look forward to the discussion with you about the current controversies and future of education. After the lecture, as usual, there will be a question and answer period. There is one mic on the lower level and one on the upper level where you can line up to ask your questions rather than shout it from your seat because no one can hear you then. Please be aware that because of time constraints this evening, we will end the question period around 9 o'clock. Please do not make personal statements about the issues, but just ask your questions because we will be able to cover a lot more ground that way. After the Q&A, Ms. Ravitch will be available to sign books in the lobby. And now I am pleased to introduce Carol Lindquist, Clinical Assistant Professor of Education and Director of Education and Secondary Education Graduate Programs in the College of Education and Public Policy at IPFW. Carol seeks to engage principal and teacher candidates in the hard questions of education, with the belief that good schools, particularly good public schools, are perhaps the greatest hope of our time. Many of you may know Carol from her previous life, her years of service to Fort Wayne Community Schools as Director of Principal Training, Director of Curriculum, and Chief Academic Officer. Carol, let's welcome Carol.
Sometimes we are in the right place at the right time, and tonight is just such an occasion. Our audience here gathered represents a strong commitment to quality education and a long history of cooperation between private, public, and parochial schools. Our region celebrates schools that are awarded Blue Ribbon and 4-star distinction time and time again, and we're the second largest district in the state, one of a small number of school districts that needs to complete data in all 37 AYP cells, was able to make AYP 2 years in a row. But we also believe that education is far more than meeting the political benchmarks assigned us. We understand the growing importance of every child being prepared for life in the 21st century and even into the 22nd century, a future we can barely imagine. As a result, our regional visioning effort has placed educational reform at the forefront. Our continued effort to have our Hoosier values of hard work, excellence, and caring for each other be prominent in all we do. We're in the right place tonight because our speaker, Diane Ravitch, is one of the most important voices of our time, researching and writing in the area of education and public policy. She has authored hundreds of articles and written many books, including her most recent book, The Death and the Life of the Great American School System, How Testing and Choice Are Undermining Education. Currently, she co-writes the blog Bridging Differences, and she had a posting today in case you want to check that out. She also blogs for Politico.com and the Huffington Post. But that's not all she's doing. She is a research professor of education at New York University and a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C. Dr. Ravitch is not a new voice in education. As an advocate for education reform, she has served in the U.S. Department of Education under both Presidents George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. A longtime historian and analyst, she helped to guide the early visions of change and accountability. But also as an historian and an analyst, she's been monitoring the impact of national trends in education and is here to give her insights about what is working and what isn't working. During this journey, during these years, she has been honored by many organizations for her courage and leadership in this difficult national conversation. So it is my distinct honor to welcome to the stage education's BFF, Diane Ravitch.
Thank you very much, and thank you, IPFW, for inviting me to Fort Wayne this evening. Thanks to everyone who works to serve your community and the children of this state, as teachers, as principals, as local school board members, as civic leaders, and as engaged parents. Public education in this state and in this nation are in a fight for survival. The legislative changes in this past year, not only in Indiana, but in many other states, have been breathtaking. Indiana has had public education since 1816. It took nearly 200 years to build a public education system in this state, and now your state officials seem intent on dismantling it in just a few years. This is not a conservative agenda. It's a radical agenda. Conservatives don't blow up traditional institutions. Conservatives don't abandon social and communal responsibility. Conservatives don't advocate reckless schemes. They believe in incremental change. They deal with real problems. They offer real solutions. They face facts. They depend on evidence. Conservatives conserve. They don't destroy. Conservatives believe in tradition and community. But what your public officials are offering is a radical agenda of testing, shaming teachers and principals based on test scores, closing schools based on test scores, and the replacement of public schools with privately managed schools, many of which will be very profitable to their sponsors with your tax dollars. Follow us, they say, and one day all problems will be solved. I say that's pie in the sky. They're foisting unproven schemes on this state that threaten the stability of communities, endanger public education, place a generation of children at risk, yet have no evidence to back them up. What they're doing is not conservative, nor is it wise. It's short-sighted, ill-considered, and it's a threat to one of our basic democratic institutions. The public schools belong to the public. Public education is a public responsibility and a public trust. It's not a business opportunity. What's happening in Indiana today is part of a powerful national movement to privatize public schools. The privatization movement has already taken charge of many prisons, hospitals, even libraries, and now it wants public schools. Public tax dollars built them, and no one should give them away to entrepreneurs and for-profit corporations. American public education is in crisis today because it's under attack. False claims are made about achievement, false claims are made about teachers, false claims are made about what's needed to improve the schools, and miracle cures are offered that have no evidence behind them. American public education is indeed the target of a well-funded, well-coordinated campaign by people who call themselves reformers. I call them corporate reformers. The corporate reformers want to impose simple-minded policies of carrots and sticks on educators. But carrots and sticks are for donkeys, not professionals. The best and most productive corporations in America are the best places to work, the places that treat their employees with respect. Unfortunately, the corporate reform movement doesn't want our schools to function like 21st century workplaces. They want to cut cost. They want more standardized testing. They never talk about ways to make schools more creative and exciting places for students and teachers alike. All they talk about is whom to fire, how to cut benefits, how to make educators do more with less, how to belittle and demean the people who do the daily work of teaching. And what they have in mind is not an environment where people take joy in their work, but something more like the factories of the early 20th century, where your pay is directly linked to your piecework and the floor boss can fire you at any time for any reason. This is not innovative thinking. This is regressive thinking. It takes us back 100 years. The corporate reformers now have the upper hand for one simple reason, not because they have good ideas, but because they have a huge amount of money and political power on their side. They can count on the Gates Foundation, the Broad Foundation of Los Angeles, the Dell Foundation, the Walton Family Foundation, and a large number of Wall Street hedge fund managers. They can count on major corporations and on groups like Stand for Children, Education Reform Now, 50 Can, or Michelle Rhee's Students First, or Teach Plus, or Indiana's own Mind Trust. They can count on the think tanks funded by the big foundations. They can count on Republicans, and they can count on Secretary Duncan. The only thing they don't have on their side is truth. Also, they don't have any evidence. And they can't point to any successes. But facts, truth, evidence, experience, and logic don't count when there's so much money and power amassed on one side of the debate. This is a scenario of David and Goliath, and the corporate reformers are indeed Goliath. For many years, I was a strong advocate of testing, accountability, and choice. In the first Bush administration in the early 1990s, I supported accountability. I subsequently worked in 3 conservative think tanks where these ideas were held sacred. In 1998, I went to Albany, New York to testify on behalf of charter legislation, the first charter legislation passed in the state of New York. I thought the testing would help teachers diagnose children's learning problems. I thought the charters would recruit the children who had failed in regular public schools. I thought that the charters would collaborate with the public schools. I was wrong. I was wrong on every count. Testing should be used to help students and help teachers, but it's been turned into a blunt instrument to reward and punish teachers and schools. Charters should serve the neediest, but many charters succeed by excluding the neediest and skimming the best. In some states, like Indiana, for-profit charters generate big dividends for investors, which come right out of the public school budget and into the pockets of their shareholders. The virtual charter schools, which are called cyber charters, so-called cyber charters, are making big profits, while the student sits home in front of a computer. Their parent is called their learning coach. The cyber charters get full state tuition, but they have no buildings, no playgrounds, no library, no custodians, no nurse, and very few teachers. It's a big cost-cutting measure. Policymakers like cyber charters because they save money. A teacher in a cyber charter may monitor 50 or 100 or even 200 screens, and no one even knows where those teachers are. Most of these teachers are recent college graduates who get low wages and will not stay around long enough to collect a pension. The state saves money, but the educational results are terrible. Study after study shows that cyber charters have lower test scores and lower graduation rates than brick and mortar schools. In Colorado, for example, only 12% of the students graduated from the Colorado Virtual Academy as compared to a statewide graduation rate of 78%, 12% compared to 78%. The attrition rate from cyber charters is high. Recent studies in Colorado and Ohio found that 50% of the students left in their first year of enrolling. First year, 50% drop out, but the money stays with the cyber charter. So the public school gets the students back, but not the money to educate them. The CEO of K-12, which is the nation's biggest online learning company, last year was paid $5 million from tax revenues, quite a bit more than your typical school superintendent. Of course, his background is Goldman Sachs and McKinsey, so he's not your typical school superintendent. And K-12 has charters in Indiana. The biggest online charter chain in this state has 3 charters. 2 of them got a grade of F from the state, and the third got a D. The first obligation of a for-profit corporation is to its investors and not to students. Another of the for-profit charter chains, right here in Fort Wayne, is known for buying properties under one entity and then leasing them back to the charter school at outrageous rentals. One of its charter schools in this town pays itself $900,000 a year in rent. Does anyone care? Some of the turnaround schools in Indianapolis have been handed over to a for-profit charter chain from Florida that has never turned a school around. I mean, this is, if it weren't so tragic, it would be comical. Why is Indiana pumping tax revenues into so many for-profit companies that don't provide a good education and have such a poor track record? Well, then, this national movement of testing and choice is the legacy of No Child Left Behind. I call No Child Left Behind the Death Star of American education. All we have gotten from it is school closings and a very punitive atmosphere towards teachers and principals and children. It's true, it has documented the shocking gaps in test scores between different groups of children, but it has done nothing to change the conditions that cause those gaps. We knew about the gaps long before NCLB, yet Congress is still patting itself on the back for identifying a problem and doing nothing to solve it. In the year 2000, during the presidential campaign, candidate George W. Bush told the nation about the Texas miracle. He said that there was a very simple way to reduce the gaps: test every child every year, reward the schools where the scores went up, humiliate the schools where the scores went down. He said Texas did this and the gaps were closing, the test scores and the graduation rates were rising, the dropout rates went down. It was almost too good to be true. He said we had to end the soft bigotry of low expectations and set the same standards for all children, whatever their race, rich, poor, advantaged, disadvantaged. So 10 years ago, Congress passed No Child Left Behind. It mandated that 100% of children must be proficient by the year 2014 in grades 3 through 8. Bear in mind that no nation in the world has ever achieved 100% proficiency. So now we know the results. No state in the nation will reach 100% proficiency. Already, more than half of our public schools across the nation have been labeled failing schools. By the year 2014, if NCLB is not changed, many more than 50% will be labeled failing schools. In Massachusetts, which is the nation's highest rated state, the highest performing on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, 80% of the schools are failing schools, did not make AYP. This is a crazy law. Can you think of any other national legislature in history that ever passed a law guaranteed to label almost every one of its public schools a failure? I mean, we have just learned to accept this idea that all public schools are failing because of NCLB. But we know something else now that we didn't know then. There was no Texas miracle. It was a tall tale. On the no-stakes federal test, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, Texas is in the middle. It's average. It's nowhere near the top. The achievement gaps did not close in Texas. The dropout rates went up, but the whole nation is stuck with this punitive testing regime. And because the schools could not reach the unreachable targets set by NCLB, the media and the public have now become convinced that American education is in decline and that dramatic solutions are needed. And so now we have this corporate reform movement imposing its radical agenda on public education. And I could go into the claims they make, for instance, about the international test scores, and they'll say, look, isn't it awful? On the latest international test, we're only at the average among the nations tested. What they don't know, or maybe they don't want to know, is when the international test began in 1964, there were 12 nations that were tested, and we came in 12 out of 12. And we're still number one, the most powerful economy in the world. Maybe those international test scores don't tell us anything about the future of our economy. So the ideas of the corporate reformers boil down to two strategies: privatization of public schools, which they treat as a silver bullet, and the deprofessionalization of teaching and administration. They believe that NCLB failed because it didn't use enough carrots and sticks. And they say that the schools should be privately managed because the free market is so much more efficient than government. They say that there are no credentials needed to become a teacher or a principal, and that educators should be judged by outcomes, which means test scores, not by any professional credentials. I wonder how they would feel about doctors who didn't have an MD. Let's just let them cut up people and see how it goes. Or lawyers who never went to law school, or pilots who never got certified to fly. The corporate reformers say that teachers will work harder if they get bonuses when the test scores go up. They say that teachers should have no job protections because fear will make them work harder. They say that if schools have low scores, they should be closed and replaced by new schools, just like a chain store would. Like a burger franchise or a shoe store would be closed if it didn't make a profit. Or the entire staff should be fired and replaced by new staff. These are very radical, draconian steps. This is unprecedented in American history. The policymakers say we need higher standards and more testing. In other words, do more of what we've been doing for the past 10 to 20 years. Many states already had a testing and accountability regime in the 1990s. Now, how exactly will more standards and more accountability and more pressure help children who are struggling to read and do math right now? This is like saying, if these children can't jump over a 4-foot bar, let's lift the bar to 6 feet and see how they do. I know how they'll do. Last fall, the federal government released the urban district test results. And again, these are the NAEP scores, national assessment. There are no stakes attached to these. They're not given to individual children. They're given to scientific samples of children in every state. It's considered the audit examination to check against the state scores. And after 10 years of NCLB, the children at the bottom were still at the bottom. The scores were lowest in the districts like Detroit, Cleveland, and Washington, D.C., where poverty and racial segregation are most concentrated. No surprise there. Some of the districts that were tested have been implementing the very market-based reforms advocated by the corporate reform movement. New York City has had mayoral control since 2002. Cleveland has had mayoral control since 1995. Washington, D.C. has had mayoral control since 2007. Chicago has had mayoral control, and that's where Arne Duncan launched market-based reforms in 2001. And of course, Milwaukee has had vouchers since 1990. So the reason that corporate reformers like mayoral control so much is they don't like the messiness of democracy. They like it when one person has so much concentrated power that they can impose decisions without all that messy debate that goes on at school board meetings. Fast implementation and what they call creative destruction tends to be, the destruction part of it is clear, the creative part is not. Well, since the mayor took charge in New York City in 2002, the city has enthusiastically imposed market-style reforms. It has more choice than any other major city. Students get to choose among 400 high schools, as well as more than 100 charter schools. All schools are given letter grades based on test scores. New York City spent $56 million on school-wide merit pay plan, and then abandoned the program because it showed zero results. And after 9 years of market-based reforms, what are the results? The achievement gap between black and white students is unchanged. On the federal test, the math scores went up, but no more so than in districts that didn't have market reforms. There was no miracle there. And the 8th grade reading scores have been flat since 2003. In short, there was no New York City miracle, and we've done this for 9 years. In Washington, D.C., the media told us about sensational test score gains, But that's not what you see on the federal test. During Michelle Rhee's tenure, 8th grade reading scores actually declined for Black students, Hispanic students, and low-income students. And most importantly, the District of Columbia public school system has the largest achievement gap by far of any city in the nation between white and Black students. It's a staggering 64 points in the 4th grade compared to an average of 30 points for all urban districts. Equally staggering, 58 points in 8th grade in reading compared to 28 points for all urban districts. It's double the size of other urban districts. In Chicago, where Secretary Duncan's reform program led to the closing of 100 neighborhood schools, the state of Illinois judged that only 18% of the new schools were successful. Chicago continues to be one of the lowest performing districts in the nation. Black and Hispanic students there have seen no improvement in their federal reading scores since 2003 in 4th grade, and in 8th grade reading, there have been no gains whatsoever for Black students, Hispanic students, white students, or low-income students since the federal testing program began in 2002. And according to the latest research, the Black-white achievement gap is larger now in Chicago than when the reforms began. Even the business community complained about the abysmal performance of Chicago students after nearly a decade of market-based reforms. But predictably, the business community said that the cure was to impose even more market reforms. Sometimes people just don't learn. In Cleveland, which has had mayoral control longer than any other city, student test scores have been flat or falling for a decade. Cleveland has had vouchers and charters. So the mayor just released a new plan about a month ago. What do you think he wants? More vouchers and more charters. In Milwaukee, 21 years ago, the state legislature passed a plan for vouchers. So Milwaukee, the argument at that time was that vouchers would specifically help low-income students and Black students. But after 21 years of vouchers, Black students in Milwaukee have among the lowest scores of any city tested by the federal government. Black and low-income students in Milwaukee's voucher schools have the same low scores as their peers in the public schools. Vouchers and competition have done nothing for the children of Milwaukee, but the state of Wisconsin, having poured $1 billion into vouchers, now wants more of the same. A new study came out a few weeks ago claiming benefits for vouchers in Milwaukee. It says the test scores aren't all that important because going to a voucher school increased graduation rates by 4 to 7%. The study also found, however, that the attrition rate from 9th grade to 12th grade was 75%. Only 1 in 4 students who started 9th grade in a voucher school stayed to the end of 12th grade. Some progress. Vouchers do nothing to improve education, but your governor has pushed them through the legislature anyway, and he's not alone. Other conservative governors, or supposedly conservative governors, like Governor Jindal of Louisiana, Governor Scott of Florida, also want vouchers. Their goal seems to be to decimate the public sector. When Jeb Bush was governor of Florida, he persuaded the legislature there to adopt 2 voucher programs. The state courts struck down the voucher program for students in failing schools, but the courts did not eliminate vouchers for students with disabilities. So it's been going on now for some years. An investigative journalist in Florida recently revealed that some of the voucher schools are fly-by-night operations conducted in storefronts, churches, and dingy homes, staffed by administrators and teachers with criminal records. Some students spend their days filling out worksheets or watching television, and one school had a class called Business Management, which sent these students with disabilities out on the street to shake hands and collect money from passersby. And Florida has poured more than $1 billion into this voucher program. Jeb Bush has been going around the country promoting the Florida model of choice and accountability. He says it's the key to reforming American education. But what you won't hear from ex-Governor Bush is that in the year 2011, 89% of the schools in Florida failed to make adequate yearly progress. His brother's program. Florida had 31 failing schools last year. 15 of them were charter schools. Just as there was no Texas miracle in the 1990s, there was no Florida miracle under Jeb Bush. Charter schools have been portrayed as a silver bullet for poor and minority children, but they're not. By their very nature, charters vary. There are some excellent charters. There are some that get high scores, but get them through rote learning and behaving like boot camps where children are taught to obey without question. Some of them are just terrible schools. And on the whole, and this has been reported in study after study after study, charters don't get different results from regular public schools. Just as there are some excellent charters, there are some excellent public schools. Just as there are some abysmal charters, there are some abysmal charter schools. They're excellent, they're good and bad on both sides. On average, what the studies show is there's no difference. Many of the charters have very small numbers of students with disabilities, much fewer than the district as a whole. Many of them have very few or no students who are learning English language learners. And many of the charters are more segregated than their surrounding districts. Nevertheless, the charter movement has very powerful supporters. Wall Street hedge fund managers love charters. They serve on charter boards. They finance advocacy groups like Students First and Stand for Children. The Walton Foundation just announced $159 million in grants, most of which will go to promote charters. Charter advocates are pushing laws like the Parent Trigger, sometimes called the Parent Empowerment Law. And under the Parent Trigger, which was started in California 2 years ago with money from the Broad Foundation, under the Parent Trigger, if 51% of the parents in a school sign a petition, they can take control of their public school and hand it over to a charter management company. And the group behind this is called Parent Revolution. It's run by Beverly Hills lawyer who has children, but I think they're too young to be in public school. But it's a well-funded group. It's funded by the Broad Foundation, the Gates Foundation, and the Walton Foundation. In my book, I call them the Billionaires' Boys Club. But I oppose the Parent Trigger. I think it's wrong. The public school doesn't belong to this year's parents. It doesn't even belong to 51% of this year's parents. It belongs to the public. Public paid for these schools. It's a public trust. It belongs to all of those who attended it in the past and to all of those who are likely to attend it in the future. And 51% of parents today should not have the power to hand it over to a private management company. This would be like if, using a New York City analogy, if you were to go into Central Park and collect signatures, if you could somehow collect the signatures of 51% of the people there, you could sell the park. No, you can't do that. Or get on a city bus and collect signatures from passengers and privatize that bus, hand it over to some other company. You can't do that. It belongs to the public. There has to be a public process and not simply hiring people to go out and collect signatures from parents. There has been, by the way, despite the passage of the charter of the Parent Trigger in California, so far not a single school has been turned over to charters because in the 2 attempts made by Parent Revolution, who sent in paid community organizers to gather signatures, both of these cases ended up in court, and they're still fighting over whether the parents really did or did not sign the petition. Getting the signatures verified and many of the parents have already moved on to other places. But just last Friday, the parents of Florida blocked the Parent Trigger, and there was a lot of money supporting passage of a Parent Trigger law in Florida. The Parent Trigger idea had the support of Jeb Bush and Michelle Rhee, and they were working this very hard. There's a Republican governor, there's Republican control of both houses in the legislature, but the parents in Florida realized that this was a transparent strategy to turn more public schools into charter schools, and they mobilized and they descended on Tallahassee, state capital. Not a single Florida parent organization supported parent empowerment, and they knew that this was a hoax on them. I call it the Parent Trigger. They knew it was a Parent Trigger. So what happened was that 8 Republicans and 12 Democrats in the state Senate voted against the legislation, and it's dead for this session. What an amazing victory for democracy. Another favorite idea of the corporate reformers is merit pay. There's only one problem. Merit pay doesn't work. It's been tried again and again since the 1920s. It has never worked. The most definitive test of merit pay was concluded in Nashville, Tennessee, by economists at something called the National Center for Performance Incentives. And they offered a bonus of $15,000 to teachers who could raise test scores. They figured that the reason merit pay had failed again and again in the past was that the bonuses were not big enough to motivate those lazy teachers. So they needed a really big bonus, and you know, the starting salary in Nashville is $33,000, so a $15,000 bonus is big money. At the end of 3 years, they reported in 2010, there was no difference between those eligible for the bonus and those who were not eligible. But this does not discourage the advocates of merit pay. In fact, just days after the announcement that the merit pay didn't work in Nashville, Tennessee, the U.S. Department of Education awarded $500 million for additional experiments in merit pay. And the merit pay comes up again and again in state after state, even though there's no evidence that it improves education or even that it raises test scores, which are not necessarily the same thing. And just last week, yet another study was released about merit pay, this time in Chicago, and once again concluded it didn't make any difference. This is the idea that never works and never dies. It may be the vampire of American education. The corporate reformers say that the way to improve education is to make it easier to fire teachers, so they take away seniority and any other job protections. And they believe just keep fear in the hearts of teachers and they'll be better teachers because they'll work harder. But the corporate reformers have no evidence whatsoever for this attack on tenure and job protections. Teachers in high-performing districts have tenure and seniority, at least until recently, and now in many states, teachers have no job protections. But if seniority and job protections were the causes of low academic performance, why aren't all charter schools doing incredibly well? Charters have no unions, charters have no seniority, charters have no tenure. Why are they consistently no better than regular public schools? Why are there so many low-performing charters when they have all of these alleged advantages? But what I've learned over the past few years, looking at all the studies, is that evidence doesn't matter anymore. The Wall Street hedge fund managers and the billionaires, and there are so many, I never knew there were so many billionaires in America, or that they were so interested in public education, but there are. They believe that, they say that they're leading the civil rights movement of our time. But I have trouble imagining Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. walking arm in arm with billionaires in a crusade to privatize control of public education. And as I watch these very far-right politicians doing their best to destroy teachers' unions, I recall that Dr. King was assassinated at the very time that he was fighting to organize the sanitation workers of Memphis, and I wonder how they dare to invoke his legacy to attack public education and public sector workers. Children should not have to depend on the goodwill and charity of the private sector to get a good education. The free market works very well in producing goods and services. It works, of course, through competition, but the market does not produce equity. In competition, the weakest fall behind. In the free market, there are a few winners and there are a lot of losers. Corporate reformers say that schools should be run like a stock portfolio. Keep the winners and sell the losers. Close the schools where the students have low scores. Open new ones. If the new ones fail, close them too and start over. That's creative destruction. But this doesn't help students who are struggling. No student learns better because his school is closed. Closing schools does not reduce the achievement gaps. Poor kids get bounced from school to school. No one wants the ones with low scores because they threaten the survival of the school. The goal of our education system should be not competition, but equality of educational opportunity. Remember that phrase? How long has it been since you heard a politician talk about equality of educational opportunity? There should not be a race to the top. What is the top? Why are we racing to get there? Why aren't we talking about evidence-based strategies to improve our schools? Why aren't we talking about the arts and history, about civics and foreign languages, about the sciences? To be a healthy society, to be a decent society, we must improve our public schools. We must improve the schools in every neighborhood. We must help the children who need help. We must treat our principals and our teachers with respect. If they need support, they should get it. None of the current carrot and stick policies will shrink the gaps. We know it because they've been tried now for the past 10 to 20 years, and they haven't succeeded. They failed, yet these reformers want to do more of them with more money and more vigor. And structural changes like charters and vouchers will not make a difference. Merit pay has never made a difference. Judging teachers by test scores demoralizes the teachers and will lead to a narrowing of the curriculum so that the districts where the children have the lowest scores will have more time for test prep and less time for the arts, less time for history and civics, less time for science, less time even for physical education. And the children who need a great education the most will get the least. And of course, many more children will be left behind. The entire current reform movement rests on a fanatical belief in standardized testing. Yet testing experts warn us that the test should be used for diagnostic purposes, not to fire teachers and to close schools. The basic rule of testing, and I spent 7 years on the National Testing Board, is that a test should be used only for the purpose for which it was designed. A test of 5th grade reading tests whether students can read at a 5th grade level. It is not a test of teacher quality. You cannot judge teacher quality by looking at student test scores. The scores are a reflection of who was assigned to the class, not the quality of the teacher. New York City recently released to the media the names of thousands of teachers, each one assigned a number from 1 to 100, supposedly showing who was the best and who was the worst. The margins of error were so large that the rankings were laughable. They were, in fact, junk science. Out of 100 points, there was a 35-point margin of error on the math test. On the reading test, there was a 53-point margin of error. Now, I have not logically figured this out. I'm not good at math. But somebody who has, let's say, a math professor can tell me if a teacher is ranked 50 and the margin of error is 53 points, then the range can be from -3 to plus 103. Makes no sense. But the release of these scores, the publication of these numbers in the media, shamed and humiliated teachers. Even teachers with high scores were demoralized because they knew how arbitrary these rankings were. Next year it could be them. They felt embarrassed for their colleagues. The Rupert Murdoch newspaper, the New York Post, which had sued to get the rankings made public, found the teacher with the lowest score in the city, and they literally hounded her. They put her picture in the paper. They banged on her father's door and told him that his daughter was the worst teacher in the city. They found her apartment. They pursued her. She had to call the police to get them away from her door. Yes, she did have the worst score in the city. What the media didn't know and didn't publish was that she taught English to new immigrants, to students who didn't know any English, and as they learned English, they left her class. Their scores didn't go up every year because her class had high turnover as the students moved in and out. But her picture was plastered all over the city as the worst teacher in the school system. How humiliating is that? Testing experts warn us that the tests are subject to statistical error, to random error, to measurement error, to human error. Sometimes the answer is wrong. Sometimes the question is wrong. Sometimes a thoughtful student will pick the wrong answer because it sounds plausible. Tests punish children for thinking too much or thinking differently. Our current emphasis on standardized testing is teaching children that every question has a right answer and that there are only 4 choices. Life will teach them that this is wrong. They need to learn to think for themselves, to stand on their own 2 feet, and to have a mind of their own. No high-performing nation in the world is bent on privatizing its public schools. No high-performing nation in the world is handing its students over to for-profit entrepreneurs. No high-performing nation in the world is judging its teachers by their students' test scores. And despite what your state superintendent, Tony Bennett, says, the root cause of low academic performance is not teachers, it's poverty. This is true not only in the United States, but all over the world. You can look at any testing program, whether it's the TIMSS or the PISA, which are the 2 international testing programs. You can look at the SAT, the ACT, the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or the state test, and what you will find is that the students whose families have the highest incomes have the highest test scores, and those with the lowest income have the lowest test scores. It's not because poor children can't learn. Of course they can learn. The reasons are obvious. Children in poverty are more likely to have poor health, poor nutrition, fewer books in the home, less educated parents, less opportunity for tutoring and travel, and fewer of the other advantages that money can buy. On the latest of the international tests, called Program in International Student Assessment, or PISA, American schools with low poverty, American schools where 10% or less of the students were officially low poverty, meaning free or reduced price lunch, had the highest scores in the world. Their scores were higher than those of the schools in Finland, Japan, and Korea. The schools that had 25% of their children in poverty had scores equal to Finland, Korea, and Japan. As the poverty level in the schools goes up, the scores go down. It's poverty that drags down our scores. So here are some solutions to our problems, and they're based on evidence and experience. Every pregnant woman should have good prenatal care so that her child is born healthy. 1 in 3 children born to women who do not have good prenatal care will have disabilities that are preventable. That will cost society far more than prenatal care. Every child should have the medical attention and nutrition that they need to grow up healthy. Every child should have high-quality early childhood education because the achievement gap begins before the first day of school. Every teacher should have at least a master's degree. Every principal should be a master teacher, not a recruit from industry or the military or the corporate world. Every superintendent should be an experienced educator. All children should have access to regular checkups. Schools should collaborate with parents in the local community, with civic leaders, and with their local business leaders to support the needs of children. Every school should have a full and balanced curriculum with the arts and sciences and history and civics and geography and math. With foreign languages and with physical education, every single day. This seems hard to believe, but there are schools in this country who cut back physical education to 1 day a week. That's unhealthy. Good health is more important than standardized tests. Every school should be recognized. Every school should be recognized as a center of its community and should have the resources and the stability and the staff to provide a good education. Every child should have time and space to play. Play is so important. It's in play that children develop imagination. It's in play that children learn to try out different roles for themselves and different ideas, and there's so much creativity involved in play, and we have taken it away from children, and that's wrong. There are now cities and states planning pre-K assessments. That makes me really sad. Testing should be used to diagnose the needs of children and not to punish and reward teachers in schools. We must stop investing in high-priced consultants and entrepreneurs and start investing in children. We must stop the trash talk about our public schools and dedicate ourselves to making every single one of them a school that's right for all its children. It will cost more, but ignorance and neglect are much more expensive. Surely our nation can mobilize the will to do what's right for the children of this nation. The status quo is not working. It will never work. Things are desperate in Indiana, as they're desperate in Louisiana, as they're desperate in Ohio, as they're desperate in so many of the states these days. But bad things don't last forever. The wheel turns. There will be another election. And as I said, the wheel turns, but the important thing to remember, it never turns by itself. It requires people putting their shoulder to the wheel to make things change. So follow the example of the Florida parents who beat back the corporate reform machine last week. Organize and mobilize to protect your community institutions, and to stop the invasion of the for-profit corporations. And I urge you, don't give up. Don't let Goliath win this battle for our future. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much for your warm welcome. And I understand there are microphones around, and I invite you, if you have any questions, to go to the microphone and ask a question and wave, because I can't see you.
We're over here.
Is it this way or
Hi, yeah. Which one?
Okay, go ahead.
She said I'm up first. Okay. First time in my life, I'm first. In many states, funding for public schools is based on property taxes. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts on how you can equalize that, because I have seen firsthand the difference between the wealthy areas and the less well-off areas in the kinds of educational experiences and opportunities that the students have.
Well, you know, the reason that the federal government got into education in 1965, when the Federal Aid to Education Bill was passed, it's called the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, was to try to equalize funding. Of course, it's never equalized funding. It's never had enough money to do that. But there must be equalization. It's simply unpardonable in a society where inequality is so ingrained. I mean, more than 20% of the children in this country live in poverty, and we are number one. We're number one among all the advanced nations of the world in the percentage of children living in poverty. And then we expect the schools to equalize while we do nothing about the terrible conditions that children live in. So I think that in my more cynical moments, which seem to be occurring more and more these days, I think that this reform discussion we're having about vouchers and charters and judging teachers by test scores and getting rid of the unions and taking away this and it's all a way of avoiding what are the most crucial issues in education, which is that when the starting line is so far apart from the kids from affluence and the kids from poverty, you cannot simply turn your back on it. And we are turning our back on it by saying, by saying that poverty doesn't make a difference, poverty doesn't matter. There was an article in the New York Daily News by Paul Peterson of Harvard the other day saying, we don't have to fix poverty, we have to fix schools. Well, schools are a reflection of society. And the fact is that he was speaking against many, many social scientists who found again and again that poverty matters a lot. And if we could reduce poverty, we would see improvement in our schools. So I think it may be a chicken and egg problem, but I don't know of any instance where the schools by themselves have overcome all the disadvantages of poverty. Maybe for a handful of kids they will, and some kids are incredibly hardworking and dedicated and ambitious and they can break through, but it doesn't happen on average or for most kids. And so I think that if we someday reach a saner place in our social policy, we will have public officials up and down the line who say, we cannot sustain this degree of inequality in our society. We must help those who are at the bottom. We must give them more assistance so that they have equality of educational opportunity and a chance to make a better life for themselves. So I don't know what the proper funding formula is, but I know that we're not talking about that today. We're only talking about these other issues, which I described tonight. And what I've on many, as I was reading more and more about Indiana and also all of these reformers all over the country, they will keep saying again and again, we have to fix the schools, let's not talk about poverty. We have to talk about poverty. Yes, I see you.
Yes, I hear what you say about standardized testing. Eradicating standardized testing completely would go a long way to solving the problems you've discussed. In all due respect, Dr. Ravitch, you're a powerful voice in education, but you cannot stop standardized testing. Parents cannot stop it. Teachers and administrators who hate it cannot stop it. Our government officials are certainly not going to stop it, and that leaves one group in this country who can put an end to standardized testing. Therefore, I call upon all the children of this country to refuse to fill in the bubbles. I call upon all parents to support their kids or keep them home on test days. I don't think teachers can do much because they've signed contracts. But if those who are leaving the profession want to, they can find a way to help. Thank you.
Well, there is a movement for, I think it's called opt-out, of parents who are going to keep their children home on testing day. There's also something called the Bartleby Project, which is an anti-standardized. It's very interesting. Really affluent people send their kids to independent schools where they have no standardized testing. But the same people will turn around and say that kids in public schools must have standardized testing. And I could tell you story after story about test questions that I've seen where the answer was wrong or the question was wrong. Or the one right now that sticks in my mind, when I was on the National Assessment Governing Board, I went to a press conference where they were releasing the results of the National Civics exam. And they had the PowerPoint, and up on the PowerPoint was a question that had been asked of the students, and it said something like this. You know, we all believe that the United States is a democratic country, but some of our institutions really are not democratic. Which of the following four things is an example of a not democratic institution? And so the correct answer was the Supreme Court. And so I was sitting in the audience, there were about 200 press people. I got up and I said, excuse me, I don't understand this. I grew up in the state of Texas. We used to have billboards all over the state saying the Supreme Court is not democratic, signed the John Birch Society. How did that get onto the National Civics exam? And there was this kind of dumbfounded silence, like, oh gosh, it was vetted by 99 committees, we don't know. And there is something, I was recently reading a very interesting book called You Are Not a Gadget, by Jerome Lanier. Jerome Lanier is one of the inventors of virtual reality, and he wrote this wonderful kind of screed about how technology and data are driving our lives to places we don't want to go, and how we had to stand up for being individuals. And he just pointed out that these standardized tests are kind of, we're making the kids live up to an algorithm, and that's wrong. He also talked about lock-in. And lock-in means that you start with a certain assumption in technology, and then future generations have that assumption locked in. He said, I keep waiting for somebody to come up with a fresh approach. No one has a fresh approach. We're still dealing with these ideas that got locked in 20 years ago in technology. And I think of standardized testing as something that's locked in. Now, it happens to work in Finland. They have no standardized testing at all in the highest international test. And yet we're locked in because we have these big testing companies that have lobbyists in the states and in the Congress, and we're locked in. We're locked into seeing our kids as being on a curve. Half of our kids will always be below grade because that's the definition of a curve. It's a normed curve. How can we break that lock-in with standardized testing? I think it's an interesting idea if you could only find some way to convince 50 million children not to pick a bubble. Yes, over here.
Yeah, you spoke about charter schools in the corporate sense. I recently went to a public hearing on a new charter school here in Fort Wayne to serve the southeast side, which is one of our poor areas of town, and it is a father and two sons. Do you have any stats on these smaller community-focused charter schools and their success rate?
You know, it all depends, because if they have no history of having run a school, how do you know? Maybe they'll create a wonderful school, maybe they'll create a bad school. I don't know. I mean, with the charter chains and what they call them charter management organizations, they have track records, and so we can say there was just a huge study of charter management organizations that reached the conclusion that they don't get better results than regular public schools. It's like study after study. So this could be a wonderful school, it could be a terrible school. One of the things that strikes me, though, is that in many states, you have the corporate reformers arguing that teachers should be evaluated by test scores, and they want more charters, but charter teachers are exempt from being evaluated by the test scores. So that creates not exactly a catch-22. It's like you tighten the regulation on the public school and you loosen it on the charter, and that makes the charters much more attractive. But I don't have any idea about the people who are opening a new charter, because I would think that I'd be reluctant to support a charter that had no evidence that the people there know how to run a school or have ever done it in the past.
Well, the 9 years at Southside, 1 year at Wayne as principal, so I think the experience is covered. But I guess I was more wondering about the smaller community-focused. Is there any studies out there
No.
on those? Thank you.
I honestly don't know. Don't know.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes.
I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about the impact of No Child Left Behind on schools with gifted children that have to focus so much on the low scores of, they don't get the time that they need to really advance, and I just wondered what you thought about that.
Well, the studies I've seen suggest that gifted children are neglected because all the focus, in state after state, No Child Left Behind is encouraged 4 levels, 1, 2, 3, 4, and proficient is 3. So all the focus is on 2. Push the 2s over to 3s, so you can kind of write off the 1s and write off the 4s, because 4s are already there, they can take care of themselves, and the 1s you write off because it's too hard to get them from a 1 to a 3. So all the focus is, they're called the bubble kids. You get them across that bubble from 2 to 3. So it's not been very good for gifted children. And I think also all the emphasis on standardized testing has been particularly bad for gifted children, because as it is, I think it's actually bad for all children, but with gifted children, I think that they just get bored more easily by being all the days devoted to testing and all the pressure to pick the right bubble. Yes, over here.
In your view, is there anything driving this besides profit? Because I'm thinking about, like, the foundations. It seems less obvious to me that it should be a profit motivation. And I'm wondering if there's something more insidious going on as well.
Well, I think that it's, they're mixed motives. And I've met many people who are very devoted to these ideas, and I've worked in think tanks where people were very devoted to them. I think it's mixed motives. I think there are people who are very, very wealthy, and they want to do something good, and so they feel that if they can help they think they're helping public schools by creating charters. What they're doing out of idealism, and I don't discount that. I feel certain that the Gates Foundation is not trying to make money for Bill Gates. He already has $50 billion. How much does one man need? There are people, however, and I think that the driving force is that there are people who really don't like government. They like the free market. They believe that if you could just privatize everything, then everything would work in a much more rational and much more efficient way. And what they have a hard time taking in is that the market will never, ever produce equality. It won't even produce equal opportunity. The market is a cruel master. I believe in the market. I'm not speaking against it. I think it's great for producing shoes and cars and all kinds of things that we purchase. But there are certain institutions like religion and the family and schools that I just think they don't belong in the free market. I think that there are communal obligations we have that cannot be bought and sold, and you can't put a price on them. There are things that schools do. There are things that schools do and should do that have been displaced by testing. So I would say that the highest goal of a school would be to help children develop into good people. And we don't know how to measure that, so we don't measure that, so it's unimportant. And then the reason we have public education is because long ago, in the early years of the United States, or even in the colonial days, people were concerned about how will we sustain our society into the future. And in the colonial days, it was about literacy in religion, and everyone should have the literacy to be able to read the Bible. But after we became a nation, the reason public education took off in the 18-teens, 1820s and 1830s was because people were thinking about how fragile a democracy is. And they were worried about how can we help create citizens who can maintain a democracy after we're gone. And so citizenship became the driving motive. The reason that we as a community contribute to public education is we're protecting ourselves by protecting the children and protecting our community. And what we're being pushed into is a market metaphor and not either a civic metaphor or a character metaphor. I happen to think that the civic, I'm kind of bothered by the idea that children are being prepared for global competition. I think that is a ridiculous motive for educating anyone. Maybe when you're in your graduate school, you're thinking about your global competition, but we shouldn't have 6-year-olds and 7-year-olds thinking about being global competitors. So, you know, as a grandmother, my feeling is I want my children to feel accepted. I want them to feel that the people who educate them really care about them and are going to expect the best of them and set high expectations for them, but that they will not, I don't want them to be ranked. I don't want them to be told that they're the best or the worst, or the top or the bottom, or that they're only mediocre. Yes, over here.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Combs. I am an education student here at IPFW. And in all of my education classes, we hear a lot of the discouraging facts that you've shown us. And as a future educator, I'll be in a classroom in hopefully just a couple of years. And my question for you is, what encouragement can you give to my generation who are coming up into this and with the hope that we can make a difference? Because I have such a passion for literature and history, and I want to give that excitement to the next generation. But with everything you've said, sometimes I wonder, what have I gotten myself into? But my passion outshines that, and I just want to know what encouraging words you have to say for me and other students here who are going into education.
Well, I think that you have to know what the facts are, and when I've described as best I could what's happening, and you have to think of yourself, I think, in two different terms. One is that you will find your reward as a teacher in the eyes of the children that you confront, and you will see how much they need you. But the worst thing about teachers is that they're so passive. They don't stand up and fight for themselves. And so the second point I would make to you is that as you're getting the psychic income of seeing that these eyes are all focused on you and they really, really need your assurance, they want your praise, they want to hear that they've done a good job, you're much better than a blinking screen any day of the week. You have to believe that you're almost like an underground guerrilla fighter and that you're waging a battle to protect these children and to protect your community. And this is a monumental struggle, and it needs all your energy. And you can't give up. You can't feel so discouraged that you say, I'm going to go and pump gasoline or something, where they'll leave me alone. You have to believe that education is what you're passionate about and by the way, I tweet a lot. I don't know if any of you here are tweeters, but I once asked this question, the same question you ask, I asked on Twitter, and I got some wonderful answers from people who said, they were all teachers, and not all of them, but the ones who responded to me said, my question was, if a student gets up and asks me the question you just asked, what shall I tell them? And they said, tell them that this is the most difficult, the most demanding, and the most wonderful job they could ever have. So go out and see those, look at those kids' eyes, but also know that you're going to have to fight for your profession. Yes, over here.
Actually, two quick questions. First, just maybe a couple of comments on a book I understand you recently reviewed, which was written by the founder of Teach for America. And secondly, what would you have said if somebody from the Indiana General Assembly had asked you or told you that, gee, we don't have any money to start any kind of early childhood program in this state. what would your response have been? Which
Okay.
was said this session.
Okay, now let me see if I get this right. You wanted to know about my review in the New York Review of Books about the TFA book?
Mm-hmm. And maybe just kind of a general reaction to that.
Yeah, well, I just did a two-part review in the New York Review of Books, and they're both online. The first one was about how Finland developed successful schools. How it didn't just happen. It wasn't because they're monolithic or they're European, because they're surrounded by other countries that look just like them that don't get the same results. So I wrote about Finland and its schools, and then the second part of the review was about Teach for America and comparing the TFA vision to the Finnish schools. The big difference is that the Finnish schools take teaching seriously as a profession. So all the teachers have to have a 5-year both academics and teacher preparation before they're allowed to become a teacher. And once they become a teacher, they're in it for life because it's a great profession. It doesn't pay more than it does here. It's just so respected. They're as respected as doctors, lawyers, or any other profession. And so I contrasted that with Teach for America being that you sign up for 2 years, you get 5 weeks of training, and then Wendy Kopp says you're the best in the world. And I challenged her on factual matters because there have been a number of articles recently that said that the TFA studies don't prove they're better than, like she'll pretend that they can close the achievement gap. And twice in her book she says, we don't need to fix poverty. And it just makes me bristle whenever anyone says that. I think it's possible to hold two ideas in your head at the same time. So she quasi-responded to me today in the Huffington Post, but she didn't actually respond to any of the points I raised. She just boasted more about how TFA was training leaders. They weren't really putting teachers in so much as leaders, and soon they would have, every state commissioner will be from TFA, and every this and every that, and 600 people doing wonderful things. But it didn't respond to any of the specific critique I had of Teach for America. What I said was, I think it's a wonderful idea, and I think that the organization is so arrogant and boastful that they have gone way overboard and allowing Teach for America to come in and replace experienced teachers. Experienced teachers get laid off, and then they hire Teach for America as an inexpensive replacement. In labor union terms, that's called scabbing. But, I've met lots of Teach for America recruits, corps members, and they're always very smart, really terrific young people who want to do the right thing. And I don't question what they're doing. I think what they're doing is wonderful. It's like the Peace Corps. I think the Peace Corps is wonderful. But the Peace Corps doesn't go to foreign countries and become an ambassador. So that was part one. And part two was, what would I say to somebody who said there was not enough money for early childhood education? I would say raise taxes. Over here. Yes, you're up. Is there anyone there? No question over there. Anyone over here then?
Yep. I'm a music ed student here at IPFW, and I've heard your views on a balanced curriculum and the importance of physical education in schools, which I totally agree with. But I've witnessed firsthand in a society where programs are being cut left and right, it's usually the fine arts that's being cut. Mm-hmm. And I'd just like to know, what are your views or values on how fine arts is?
Well, whenever I describe the necessity of a balanced and rich curriculum, I always say the arts first. And by the arts, I mean music and dance, and obviously there are many more arts in addition to music and dance. But I think that there is almost a spiritual quality to the arts, and that children need the arts. They need self-expression. And they need something, that they want to come to school for. They'll want to come to school to do the arts, but I've never ever heard of anyone saying, my children want to come to school to be tested. They can't wait. So with the arts, I think that there is a dimension of expressing our humanity that's very crucial. And it's creativity, it's letting go, it's inventing new things. It's, when you see kids, what is there that is more universal than music and dance? Every society in the world has some form of music and dance although in some places it's so desperately wanted that it's prohibited. But this is something that I think is fundamental to human beings, and the idea that it would not be available to young children is almost unimaginable, except it's happening in many districts across this country. I mean, you're right, the arts are the first thing to be cut.
I heard that the physical educations are being cut. Do you know why they're being cut?
The physical education?
Yes, you said like take phys ed are being cut from the schools.
Well, I can tell you that in Florida, in many districts, they give children a DVD and tell them to take it home and do their exercises in front of the television. They're being cut. In many districts have eliminated recess. There are districts that eliminated physical education or cut back on the time for it, saying instead of 5 days a week, it'll be 2 or 3 days a week or even 1 day a week, because it's budget cuts and because they really want to save the time for what's most important, which is preparing for the state test.
But that's bad, because we have to exercise. If you have to get to, because that's called obesity, because a lot of people, because a lot of today's certain food is not good for you. A lot of school today and certain bad foods are not good for you, because if you don't exercise, you're gonna make yourself, sometimes you make yourself sick, you know?
Well, you're right, because in classical times there was a saying in Latin, a healthy mind and a healthy body. And it's very hard to, if you're not healthy, to just be in charge of your life. So physical education should be one of the basics. I went to school many years ago in Texas. We had physical education every day. I didn't think that was, like a privilege, but it's being treated as a privilege these days, which is ridiculous. Yes, sir.
I'm Kevin Boyd. I'm running for Congress to address some of the issues that you're talking about, and I'd like to hear your comments on what you think the proper role of the federal government is in education.
Oh, thank you for asking. I have given that a lot of thought because in the early 1990s, I worked in the first Bush administration as assistant secretary, and I've given a lot of thought because the federal government role has changed so much. Until No Child Left Behind, it would have been unthinkable that the federal government would be telling local school districts what to do or how to reform or holding a hammer over their head. So I think the federal role should be this. First of all, it should be what it traditionally, or at least for the last, since 1965 has been, and that is a guarantor of equality of educational opportunity. Now, it has never had the money to actually equalize across the nation, but the federal funding, its primary purpose was to send money to the districts that needed it most. But what we have now is the idea that states have to compete to get the money. And there's still Title I grants that are going out by formula, but I don't think it's right for the federal government to create a competition to get federal funds when we know that there are districts that desperately need extra funding to provide the things that are now being cut. So I think that equity is the first role. A second role is that the federal government has a responsibility to protect the civil rights of children on whatever the laws are of the moment, and it does that. The third role is that it has a responsibility to collect data, research, information, and to make that available. That was the original, back in 1867, was when the U.S. Office of Education was created, and its mission was to report to the American people on the condition and progress of American education. So one of the things the federal government now does is that it gives a test every other year to samples of students. So we're able to look at state scores and national scores in reading and math, and also in some specific areas where it's only national, like history and civics and writing and so forth. That's part of the federal role, just reporting to the American people on the progress and condition of education. But equity is the number one role. And then the secretary has a bully pulpit. The fourth role is he can get out there and give speeches all the time to talk about how important it is that every child get an equal opportunity for education. But those are the key things: the research role, the equity role, the civil rights role. The federal government these days has gone way beyond that, and it now acts as though We know what the answers are, and you can compete to get money if you agree to do what we tell you. That's the way Race to the Top was framed. $5 billion, but you could only get it if you agreed to have more charter schools, if you agreed to evaluate teachers by student test scores, and if you agreed to create big data systems so that there would be more information to collect about everybody, and you could then reward and punish teachers. But you couldn't get the money unless you agreed to do those things. But you see, neither Congress nor the U.S. Department of Education has the knowledge or the competence to tell everyone how to reform their schools. They're too far away from the schools, and the problems are different in different schools and in different communities. You cannot have one solution for the schools of Indiana, the schools of Nevada, the schools of California, of Maine, of Florida. It's the people on the ground that have that primary responsibility because they're there. So I think that the accountability role of No Child Left Behind was a huge overreaching. And now there are districts that literally have to get waivers. Now, I'm not talking about Arnie Duncan waivers, but just they have to go to the federal government and get permission to do things that they think are right and that they believe will work for their kids. And that's not the way the system's supposed to work. So I think the federal role should be a limited role, and it should focus on the children who have the greatest needs. Also, subsidizing the education of special ed is part of the federal role, and there the federal government has fallen down. When the special ed legislation was passed, Congress said specifically that they would pay 40% of the cost. They've typically paid between 12 and 15%. If they were to fully fund the 40% they promised, it would lift the fiscal burden of every district in this country. Another question over here?
I agree with the situation. Pretty much, we've been doing all testing from kindergarten up to graduation, but we're not prepared to live outside. Once we're over 18, some of us don't go to college because they have no idea whether or not they could or can they. Can they sustain themselves? They don't learn anything hands-on because you cut out home ec, you cut out shop. There's a variety of shop. Even my high school had an auto shop. So hey, if you knew how to fix a car, you had it made. At least you had some means of making money, or you took care of what you had. And they pretty much threw those out without tweaking it to sustain or let kids learn how to do things for themselves while they're also learning the basic ABCs and physics, if they're going to start doing that in 7th grade. But I want to know if they can, believe they should bring back shop and home ec, but make it more sustainable or green in a sense. Have kids in kindergarten start with seeds, and as they get older, they learn a little bit more about being sustainable, while also learning how to be a citizen and also be a scientist. Right. Should we go that direction?
Well, I think that it's very important for children to learn to do things with their hands, because, you know, that's, again, when you talk about things that virtually everybody has inherent in them, one of them is tinkering, playing around with things, trying to fix things, trying to make things. My worst subject in school was home economics, so I'm not sure I want to talk about that. But I do think seriously that there is something really important in having some crafts in the schools where girls and boys can learn to make things, learn to use their hands, and do things that are not abstract. You know, the curious thing is that in some sense you'd say, oh, well, our schools are now focused on academics, and isn't that good? Academics. Really, they're focused on very low-level basic skills. And it's not academic excellence to have every child focus solely on English and mathematics most of the time, because that's all that counts. I think that people need a healthy balance, and that's why I believe very much in the arts and in physical education and some kind of craft work, because I think that it's important to have that healthy balance of the whole human being. I was very impressed when I was in Finland last fall, visiting the children in a wood shop, and the girls and boys were making boxes, little boxes, and they had hammers and they had nails, and my friend with me, who was an educator, said, "Oh my God, in my school we'd all be sued. The kids would have nails in their hands." But you know, part of this is about the litigiousness of our society, and that people are afraid to take any risk. But school has to be more than just using a textbook or using a computer and abstracting numbers and letters, and this is all symbolic learning. And human beings need to know the symbols, they need to master the symbols, but preparation for life is bigger and richer and deeper and wider than symbolic learning alone. So if you take anything away from tonight, I hope it will be a commitment to work for a richer curriculum, and to work quietly or loudly or however you choose in your community to build support for the work that the teachers and principals and educators are doing, and to understand that collaboration and working together is far better than competition, that we're preparing our kids to live in a dog-eat-dog society, which means that dogs will continue to eat dogs. But we don't want our children to be at war for the rest of their lives. We want them to live in a cooperative, peaceful world. And so while the word collaboration is not exactly a battle cry, collaboration beats competition. I was thinking about the whole situation, thinking, last line, that it's a little bit like we're all in this rowboat and we've all been given oars. And the guys who are barking out the orders are saying, each of you are going to be paid based on how many times you hit the water. That boat's going nowhere. You have to row together to make it work. Thank you very much.